Hi, my name is Peter Rich. I am a professor of instructional psychology and technology at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. This is a data debrief looking at the pre and post surveys for cohort 2 from Aldine, who participated this year in the BootUp trainings. So just give a little bit of overview of what that entails is at the beginning of the first training this year, teachers would have received and taken the survey to find out about their beliefs about teaching coding, their self-efficacy for coding, and a little bit about who they are. At the end of the year, we give the same survey as well as asking some additional questions about their teaching practice over the course of the year, their thoughts on the BootUp trainings, as well as their own self-efficacy and confidence for coding and computational thinking, how those have changed over the course of the year. So that being said, I thought I'd start off with a quote from one of the teachers. You can see here, this kind of just gives a feeling in terms of how many of the teachers responded about their confidence about teaching coding and how it had changed over the course of the year. So that being said, who are the teachers for whom we have data? You can see in the pre-survey, it was completed by 23 teachers representing 12 different schools. And the majority of those teachers, the vast majority, both pre and post, were classroom teachers. You see the post, we only had about a third of the teachers respond from that group in the post, representing about half the number of schools. So we still have 6 schools represented. Most of those are also classroom teachers, and 1 library media specialist in both groups participated. As far as teaching experience goes, you can see on average teachers have got looks like they're kind of past their first few years of teaching. They're getting their legs under them, about 7 years on average of teaching experience. It looks like the younger teachers didn't complete the post or weren't participating in the BootUp trainings by the post assessment. So you can see there's a lot more years of experience on average for the teachers at the end of the year. And in both cases, you see there's really not much coding experience amongst the teachers. In fact, when I looked at the numbers individually, I'd say that the most occurring number of the teachers is actually 0 years of experience. There was one teacher with 4 years coding experience, and so she pulled those numbers up a little bit more than the others. So this is a group of teachers really new to coding, a little bit more hesitant than you might imagine somebody who's already had some experience teaching coding. So one of the questions we asked then, looking at teacher practice over the course of the year, is how often they get to teach coding. You can see this is more on the left-hand side. So they're teaching about once a month, and the majority of teachers, or once a semester in terms of seeing the same students. So teachers are teaching about once a month. Their students are getting it maybe once or twice a semester, maybe a little bit more than that, but not much. So this is kind of at the beginning stages. My guess is as teachers teach more often and you see that shift from left to right, that you might see their numbers go up in terms of some of the other numbers of confidence that we'll look at. That being said, even though they weren't teaching as frequently, it looks like their lessons were probably all integrated lessons, where you've got a lesson in each of the areas on average being taught in language arts, social science, sciences, and actually 3 mathematics lessons taught over the course of the year in terms of the average lessons taught for teachers. So even though they might not be teaching as frequently, teachers are reporting teaching in these across the curriculum, I would say, pretty evenly when they are teaching coding with more emphasis in mathematics overall. This was an interesting aspect of their practice as well. Usually when I look at new coding teachers and I ask how they teach their coding lessons, they will rely pretty heavily on the curriculum that BootUp provides, either teaching you straight from the curriculum or only making minor changes. This is a group that seems to be quite assertive in adapting the lessons with major changes or creating their own lessons. So this is actually usually indicative of people with more experience and more confidence in teaching coding. So that's really interesting to me. As far as the pre and post survey goes, I ask about, there's a section of the pre-survey and the post-survey that asks about 30 questions about teachers' beliefs about coding. These entail questions about the value or the importance that teachers ascribe to coding for their children. Questions like, it is important that all kids learn how to code. I believe all kids can learn how to code. My students are going to need to learn how to code in the future for their future careers, or coding benefits them in cognitive ways. Now, the scale that I use is a 6-point scale. The bottom half of the scale, the 1, 2, and 3, those are the disagree indicators. So a 1 would be somebody strongly disagreeing with one of those statements. A 2 would be disagreeing, and a 3 would be somewhat disagreeing. Whereas the 4, 5, and 6 is on the positive side of the scale, somewhat agree, and strongly agree. So you can see here, teachers started off in Aldine in cohort 2 agreeing with the statements about the importance of coding. So they started off kind of in a good spot already at about a 5, understanding that and believing that coding is important. Computational thinking gets at their own self-efficacy for computational thinking sans coding. So these will get at questions like, I'm good at problem solving, or when I see a complex problem, I can break it down into its parts. I can find patterns in data. You can see here teachers were closer again to the agreeing with those types of statements, a little bit between agree and somewhat agree, but more towards the agree side. Where we see most of the growth this year happens in the coding and the teaching coding self-efficacy constructs. This has a lot to do with questions like specific to coding. I know how to use a loop. I can use a conditional statement when I need to. Those types of questions. You can see teachers started off somewhat disagreeing with those statements. Given their lack of coding experience, that's exactly where I would expect them to start. The good news is by the end of the year, they're partway between somewhat agree and agree, moving well up that scale. So that's a really good growth. I always look for teachers to be kind of between that 4 and 5 range by the end of their first year. In teaching coding, because this is an experienced group of teachers, they were more confident to begin with. They didn't quite reach that somewhat agree level, so this is about as neutral as you can get on this scale in terms of teaching coding. This gets at questions like, I know how to help a student troubleshoot or debug their code when they encounter problems. I can help students find the resources they need to learn how to code. So there's a bunch of questions we ask about that. You can see at the beginning of the year, they were pretty neutral on whether or not they could do that. But by the end of the year, they're halfway between that somewhat agree and agree, moving towards the agree end of that. So that's good growth as well, as we kind of see that from the beginning to the end of the year. The other thing we measure from beginning to the end of the year is what are teachers feeling about coding? You know, how excited are they to learn coding? What is their anxiety level? And what is their confidence to teach coding? So you can see here, teachers started off pretty positive. 8 out of 10 on that 1 to 10 point scale is quite positive. They ended more or less in the same place in terms of their excitement. So that one's a little bit below an 8, but that's actually statistically about the same in terms of where they were from beginning to end. And you can see that their confidence on the right-hand side grew quite a bit. You went from about a 4.5 to just not quite a 6.5, but about a 6.25 to 6.5 in that range. So their confidence is increasing. It hasn't quite gotten into that positive 7+ level yet. I think if we were to see teachers teach more often, then you'll see that confidence grow even more. So definitely want to see the confidence get above a 6 by the end of their first year. It's great to see it get above a 7, and probably not above an 8 usually until at the end of their second year, where you start to see that. More than anything, confidence to teach coding tends to increase as teachers teach coding more often. So again, going back to that earlier scale where we saw teachers on the left-hand side in terms of the frequency of teaching coding, if that shifts more to the right where they're teaching coding at least once a week, then I think you'll see that confidence grow. And that takes me to this anxiety question as well. One thing to remember, this is a 10-point scale, so the fact that the anxiety is below a 5 means that they're not feeling tons of anxiety, but their anxiety didn't change much throughout the course of the year. So it's kind of like their excitement as well. They're kind of in the same spot they were in terms of rating themselves on this 10-point scale. Now, that being said, I think we have some qualitative responses from teachers that will give more depth to the story about what they're feeling. So I asked them to rate their experience with BootUp. The average number of trainings they attended was 3.63 throughout the course of this year. And asked them to rate, how does BootUp compare to other professional development trainings that you've been a part of on a 10-point scale? And they rated that as an 8.3 almost out of 10. So that is, I think, really positive in terms of they saying this is a good training, they like the trainings. And I asked them specifically to give me more information in their own words about their feelings about teaching coding both before and after. And you can see here, you've got the same person on the left-hand side as the right-hand side. So the person here initially said they were feeling anxiety, right? But now they want to keep learning. I wasn't interested, but now they're excited. They were fine. They wanted to learn more, and now they feel better and they're more confident. Somebody went from very hesitant to excited and hopeful. And to figure out ways to incorporate it into their coding lessons. So that does speak to the high level of integration that we saw, despite the less frequent teaching of coding that they were doing. This next person said they'd never experienced before, and now they think it's great to introduce students to teach it along with a curriculum and create projects according to what they're learning. So again, another good integration perspective. And these last two, again, we see somebody going from scared to excited and somebody going from negative to positive. So even though over here we're seeing that the anxiety and the excitement started high in a very positive area, and anxiety started low, both of those things kind of stayed where they're at. Their confidence increased from the bottom half of that 10-point scale to moving up the other direction, which is great. And you can see here as teachers talk about their experience in their own words, I would say on the left-hand side we can see people feeling more scared and hesitant, and on the right-hand side we see this being a more excited and positive experience. So that's kind of my analysis overall of how teachers are doing in Aldine this year. This is all cohort 2 data. As I look at this, I would say keep up the good work, keep working with teachers, and I would encourage them to teach coding a little bit more frequently if possible. That's the one area that kind of stuck out to me in terms of things that teachers could do to improve and maybe increase their confidence a little bit more. At the same time, I see a lot of positivity in the fact that the teachers are already adapting and majorly and creating their own lessons for coding. So I think that's a positive indicator of how the teachers are doing, and hopefully that will continue as they move forward and they move into their second year of training. So if you have any questions for me, please feel free to email me. My email is peter_rich@byu.edu. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.